This video is brought to you together with Skillshare. Use the link in the description below for a special deal just for you. It's evening on the 24th of June 1982. The sun has just set and darkness has fallen upon the Boeing 747-200 from British Airways, which is cruising along at 37,000 feet over the eastern Indian Ocean. The flight crew has settled back into their seats after a nice meal when they suddenly start seeing the most incredible display of St. Elmo's fire over their windscreens. As they're looking out over their wings, they can also see that the same type of glow is engulfing the entire aircraft and also coming out of their engines. It is incredibly beautiful, but also, as it turns out, incredibly dangerous, because as the pilots are trying to figure out what it is they're seeing, the first engine flames out. What happens after this is an absolutely incredible story, and it is the story of British Airways Flight 009. Stay tuned. British Airways Flight 9 was the third leg on a flight that had originated in London in the United Kingdom, and then the aircraft had proceeded via Bombay to Kuala Lumpur, where this flight starts, and it was supposed to continue via Perth, then to Melbourne, and then finally inbound to Auckland, New Zealand. The aircraft being used was a 3-year-old Boeing 747-200 equipped with 4 Rolls-Royce RB211 jet engines. On board the aircraft, as it departed from Kuala Lumpur, was 247 passengers and 15 crew members. And most of those passengers had actually been on board from the very beginning in London, but the flight crew had boarded in Kuala Lumpur to fly the leg over to Perth in Australia. In the cockpit was a relatively young but still very experienced flight crew consisting of 41-year-old Captain Eric Moody. Together with him was 32-year-old Senior First Officer Roger Greaves and 40-year-old Senior Flight Engineer Barry Townley Freeman. Captain Eric Moody had started his career way before as a glider pilot, and that's going to actually turn out to be quite important during this incident. During the pre-flight preparation, when the pilots got their briefing material together and they started looking at how the flight was going to progress, it looked like the weather was going to be quite nice. There was only some light clouds, but generally no turbulence forecasted and no adverse weather in the briefing. And it looked like the flight was going to take about 5 hours over towards Perth.
And we went to the airport, and the airplane was a little later coming in. So instead of rolling down the runway at 7, I think it was 7:30 before we took off. There was nothing abnormal about the night. It looked like a lovely, pleasant night's ride down to Perth. It was about 5 hours flight time. So it was my sector, and eventually we trundled down the runway. I made a point of saying it was half an hour later than it should have been. Well, that had a great significance on what happened to us later on.
Captain Eric Moody decided that he was going to be pilot flying for the first leg, so the crew went out to their aircraft, they boarded the passengers, taxied out, took off normally, and then started climbing down south over the Indian Ocean. The first part of the flight was very nice and routine. The crew was cleared up to their cruising level of 37,000 feet. Once they had achieved that, they kind of relaxed back in their chairs a little bit. They were served dinner because the time was now about 20:15 local time. And they joined up with the airway Bravo 69, which took them on a route just south of Jakarta. But what the crew didn't know was that beneath them, on the island of Java, a volcano called Gulangong had a continuous eruption for the last few months. And during that eruption, the volcano had been throwing out loads of lava and volcanic ash high up in the atmosphere. Now, at this time, there was very little knowledge about what kind of effect volcanic ash could have on the aircraft engines. So there was no notice going out to any of the pilots or the airlines about an active volcano in the area. After Captain Moody had finished his meal, he needed to go to the toilet. So before he handed over the controls to First Officer Roger, he took a last scan on the weather radar, and the weather radar showed absolutely nothing. So he got up, handed over the controls to first officer, went out of the cockpit, and when he went to the crew toilet, he found out that was occupied. So instead he took the stairs down to the first class lounge in order to look for a toilet there. And when he reached there, he started chatting with one of the flight attendants about, how life was, something that we tend to do when we go out and visit the toilets. But he had only started chatting to the flight attendant when he was abruptly called back up to the flight deck again by one of the other cabin crew that was still up in the crew quarters. And as he started to walk up the stairs again, he noticed that the vents, the floor vents that is just next to floor level, that there was white smoke puffing out of those vents.
The stewardess who'd been in the first class, in the upstairs loo, which I tried to get in, came halfway down the stairs and she said, "Captain, you're wanted upstairs on the flight deck." So I went up the stairs, and the first thing I noticed then was that around the lower part of the walls where the air conditioning air comes in, it seemed to be billowing in smoke. And I could smell this acrid electrical burning smell. So I thought, oh dear, I'm going to go on the flight deck and they're going to say, "Can we fire the fire extinguishers in the electronics bay or something?" But nothing was further from the truth, because I went through the door. The other two said, "Come and look at this, it's beautiful."
When he entered the cockpit, he was greeted with a display that he had never seen before. There was what looked like St. Elmo's fire everywhere over the windshields. St. Elmo's fire is an electrical phenomenon that tends to happen when we fly close to electrically charged particles. So, for example, close to thunderstorms or so, where it looks like a pattern of lightning that moves over the windshield. Now, St. Elmo's fire in itself is not dangerous. In fact, it's quite beautiful. But it does indicate that you tend to be close to thunderstorms. So Captain Eric went back, sat down in his chair. He was very happy to see that the crew had already switched on the continuous ignition on all 4 engines. And he started scanning the weather radar in front of him. But to his amazement, there was no thunderstorms around. In fact, the weather radar was just as clear as it was when he left the cockpit just a few minutes earlier.
When you're going in the flight deck, you see this, you go to sit down. Well, I'm getting into my seat. I'm twiddling the radar to see where this, I thought there had to be a big QNIM somewhere and we were in the thin cloud at the top because I thought you needed moisture, because we usually see it in the tops of high QNIMs or other, or when you're on the ground and on the diffuser run the engines up in the winter, you get fog. You can get St. Elmo's fire, and that's what I thought it always had to happen. Yeah. And I've never seen it like that before. And well, as I'm buttoning my seatbelt up and I'm fiddling on the radar, I could see no clouds around, as I had before I left the seat. I checked the weather.
But this incredible show of St. Elmo's fire just continued, and as the crew started looking outside of the cockpit back towards the wings and the engines, they realized that there was this bluish glow coming from the leading edges of the wings and also from inside of the engines, creating a very strange stroboscopic effect that, together with the turning fan blade, looked like the fan blades was kind of moving slowly backwards. The pilots had never seen anything like this before, and when they started looking forward towards their windscreen again, they realized that the St. Elmo's fire had been replaced with something that looked like trace fire. If you've seen images from war zones, for example, you know that when they shoot with certain guns, every, 100 bullet or so is a trace bullet that gives those kind of glowing track lines. That's trace fire. And that's exactly what it looked like on their windscreen. But Captain Moody, he was worried about other things, because he had seen that whitish smoke that had been coming out from the air conditioning vents, and he knew that smoke in an aircraft is never a good thing. So he had started thinking about what to do about this. But before he could even finish that thought, Flight Engineer Barry called out, "Engine failure." Engine number 4. The time was now 2040 local time, and this announcement by the flight engineer took the situation to a completely new level. Captain Eric called out, okay, engine failure and shutdown checklist please. And flight engineer Barry started executing that checklist, and that included items like putting the thrust lever back to idle, the engine start lever to cut off, but also in British Airways pulling the engine fire handle, right? Not actually putting any of the extinguishers into the engine, but arming them so that they were ready to use in case they would be needed. As soon as the engine failure shutdown checklist was completed for the number 4 engine, Barry shouted out again. This time he said, engine failure number 2, 3 has gone. They've all gone. So this means that in a matter of a few minutes, this Boeing 747 had gone from a completely controlled normal flight into a flight where now all 4 engines had simultaneously failed. This is a potential catastrophic situation, and the way that the flight crew handles this from this point on is going to be crucial for how successful they are with recovering it. Captain Moody was stunned by this announcement, and he looked down onto his engine instrumentation, and what he saw was a very confusing picture, because on the Boeing 747-200 at the time there were 2 sets of different engine manufacturer indicators. So there was both Smith instrumentation and General Electric instrumentation, and some of them showed the engine values frozen where they were when the engine failed. Other ones went off the scale, making the picture that he was seeing almost impossible to get your head around. And another thing that made him very confused was that he had actually practiced a quad engine failure, as in 4 engine failure scenario in the simulator a few months earlier. But when they did that, almost all of the lighting in the cockpit disappeared, together with all the instrumentation on the first officer side and some other system. But in this scenario, it seemed like at least one of the engines and the generator connected to it was still producing power, giving it a completely different sensation than what he had had in the simulator earlier on. And here Captain Moody makes a very important decision, because when he looks down on his primary flight instrumentation, he realizes that his speed is starting to tick down. Something that you would expect from an aircraft maintaining 37,000 feet without any engine power. And he also realizes that because he still has some electrical power coming from one of the generators, the autopilot is still working. So he puts the aircraft into a shallow descent, just enough to maintain the airspeed. So he is now focusing on flying the aircraft, making sure that the aircraft doesn't go into a stall and that he has complete control over it. He also initiates a left-hand turn back north again. Okay, because remember, they have passed the city of Jakarta a few minutes earlier, and they're now out of the sea. If he makes a left-hand turn, he will start heading back towards land and towards a potential airport. He also tells the first officer Roger to please send out a mayday call. So at time 20:44, this is 4 minutes after they started seeing the first lights in the cockpit, the following call is made to Jakarta control. Jakarta, Jakarta, Mayday, Mayday, Speedbird 9, we've lost all 4 engines. We're leaving flight level 370. Initially, air traffic control didn't fully understand this message. They thought that they heard that they had lost engine number 4, which is very different from having lost all 4 engines. But that kind of miscommunication kind of makes sense when you think about the likelihood of hearing that an aircraft has lost all 4 engines. That just doesn't happen.
The engineer and myself went through the first checklist, and I detailed the co-pilot to send out the mayday call, which is when he had the first problems, because there was so much static around the aircraft for obvious reasons that his communications were intelligible. And it took a little while to get through to the Jakarta Air Traffic Control, who's English. I mean, we're talking about 1982. You go out that way now, it's not fantastic. But in 82, it was even worse. And he had great trouble getting through to them because it was a non-standard phrase. All 4 engines had failed. If he'd said number 4 engine has failed, they might have understood that. But he said all 4. And eventually, it took a Singapore Airlines aeroplane, who was about half an hour behind us on the same route, to relay to them. No, they have no power going, no power.
What has actually happened here, which I'm guessing most of you have already guessed, is that the aircraft has flown into a layer of high altitude volcanic ash. Volcanic ash is spread from volcano basically in two different ways. So you have the main black plume. That's what you're all thinking about when you're thinking about a volcanic eruption, which is mainly pieces of brimstone, ash, lava, stones that are being thrown out on top of the volcano. But then, higher up, this gets separated into the finer kind of ash dust. And this tends to be whitish in color. If you've ever seen a satellite photo of a volcanic eruption, you tend to see the black main plume going one way, and then you'll see a slight white cloud going a slightly different way. This whiter cloud tends to be containing smaller particles, down to as small as 1 micrometer, and it can travel hundreds of kilometers away from the main volcano. It can also be included in cloud masses and so on. These particles are electrically charged. That's why you sometimes see these lightning bolts from a volcanic eruption. But this is what caused that St. Elmo's fire that the flight crew saw, and also the lights from inside of the engine. The reason that the weather radar didn't show anything was because the weather radar is not designed to pick up particles as small as the volcanic ash particles are. Remember, volcanic ash can be as small as 1 micrometer, and most of the particles at those altitudes are not much bigger than that. And because of that, the weather radar, which is designed to pick up moisture and droplets, didn't see anything. In order to see things like volcanic ash, you would need a weather radar with a very different wavelength, okay, a smaller wavelength. But the weather radar on board the 747-200 did not have that, hence Captain Moody did not see anything on his weather radar, even though he was surrounded by large concentrations of volcanic ash. If someone was trying to create a material that was solely designed to disrupt aircraft systems and be damaging to aircraft, then volcanic ash would be pretty close to the ideal material. Because this type of volcanic ash will not just attack one system, it will basically attack all of the aircraft systems. So the main threat obviously is what it's doing to the engines, because these tiny little particles, if you look at them with your naked eye, it looks kind of like baking powder, right? Or baking flour. But if you use a microscope, you will notice that they tend to be mostly silicates. And these silicates are extremely sharp, making this material very abrasive. So the first thing that will happen to the engines is that the engines are sucking in enormous volumes of air. And that means that it will concentrate the volcanic ash inside of the engine. And this abrasiveness will start to wear down the fan blades, the compressor blades, and the turbine blades, changing the aerodynamic property of these blades, causing things like engine stalls. But as the ash goes further into the engine and into the hot part, the melting point of these silicates is around 1100 degrees Celsius, while the normal working temperature of a jet engine inside of the core can be as high as 1400 degrees Celsius or higher. So this means that these silicates are now melting into glass, and this will get stuck onto the igniters, onto the fuel nozzles, and onto all of the hot parts, the turbine blades and so on, that's coming after the hot part. And this can stifle the engine completely. But on top of that, this high abrasiveness of the volcanic ash will start sandblasting the outer part of the aircraft. So the aircraft's windows, for example, the pitot tubes, the static probes, the angle of attack vanes, all of those can be damaged, causing faulty instrument readings inside of the cockpit. And then the volcanic ash will get its way in through the air conditioning ducts, for example, stopping vanes and valves inside of the air conditioning and being pumped into the aircraft, where it will smell like sulfur, or that acrid smell that Captain Eric Moody felt. Also, it's going to be irritating for eyes, people breathing it in. It's not good for anything. But it also goes into the fuel tanks through the to the vents, the air vents, where it contaminates the fuel. So all in all, going into a high-level volcanic ash cloud with high concentrations of ash is a very, very bad thing for the aircraft. The flight crew knows nothing about this, so they are now working frantically on trying to restart the engines. And they're discussing whether or not they're going to try to restart engine number 4 as well. Remember the one that they did the engine failure and shutdown checklist for, because they pull the fire handle. And if you pull the fire handle, then that engine will not be restarted unless you push that fire handle down again. And together they say, well, we have very little to lose from trying to restart it. So they continue to try to restart all 4 of them, but none of them start to begin with. Instead, as the crew now descending through about 26,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning goes off. That's because the pressurization in the aircraft works with using bleed air from the engines, and since none of the engines are working, there's no bleed air being fed to the aircraft, which means that the pressurization inside of the cabin is starting to leak out in various ways, and the cabin altitude has now reached over 10,000 feet. This means that the flight crew needs to get on oxygen quickly, because they won't be able to last for very long without starting to suffer from hypoxia. So they call for it, they put the masks on, but when the first officer tries to put his mask on, it turns out that it hasn't been fitted properly. So it basically falls to bits in his hands. So Captain Moody is now faced with a very hard decision. Either he can try to maximize his glide using his own oxygen, but risking that his first officer will succumb to hypoxia and become unconscious. Or he can go in and he can do an emergency descent, in which case he would potentially lose, very valuable altitude, but he will have the benefit of his whole flight crew with him. He decides on doing the emergency descent, which means that he's now pitching the aircraft forward into a dive. But as he's doing this, the standard operating procedure for the 747 to do this would be to lower the landing gear as well, to get maximum drag during this maneuver. But he discusses this with his fellow pilots, and they decide not to do this because they know that lowering the landing gear will require a lot of hydraulic fluid. But none of the engines are working, which means that they don't know how much hydraulic pressure they have. And they don't want to risk lowering the landing gear and then not having any flight controls to control the aircraft. So they decide to keep the landing gear up. They start diving. And here is also where Captain Moody realizes that there is a difference of indicated airspeed on his airspeed indicator to what is shown on his first officer's one. Remember how we talked about how the volcanic ash can come into the pitot tubes? Well, in any case, he decides that his, which is showing around 320 knots, is probably the one that is working better. So he decides to focus and continue to use his own airspeed indicator. This type of discussion that the flight crew is now having about very complex systems and how these systems might react in a situation they've never faced before shows a very good understanding and situational awareness of the aircraft. And on top of this, First Officer Roger, as they're now descending, has managed to fix his own oxygen mask, so he can now put it on and get oxygen properly. And this means that as the aircraft is descending past about 20,000 feet now, the crew levels off the aircraft, continues to descend, but not with such a rapid descent rate anymore. Because now they're facing the next problem. And the next problem is that the mountains ahead of them, between them and Jakarta, are quite high. They have a safety height of 10,500 feet. So the crew needs to decide whether or not they can actually glide past these mountains safely. And what they decide is that if they reach 12,000 feet and they haven't managed to start any of the engines, which means that they will continue to descend, well then, instead of trying to transgress the mountain range, they will just make a right-hand turn out of the sea again and try to ditch the aircraft in the water. And this consideration was another reason that Captain Moody didn't want to lower the landing gear, because he knew that if he had lowered the landing gear, he wouldn't be able to retract it, and if he would have to ditch the aircraft in the ocean, he did not want to do so with the landing gear selected down. The crew continues throughout this entire descent to try to relight the engines. They take turns trying each engine to see if one would start when the other one wouldn't. But initially, none of them will start. However, when they're putting fuel into the engines are actually igniting. They're just not starting up properly. But that has a secondary effect of showing flames coming out to the back of the engines. And this means that the poor passengers that are sitting at the back of the aircraft, if they were looking out of the wings, would be shown of a display of 4 engines on fire, which would be absolutely terrifying. And with this in mind, Captain Moody decides that he needs to make a PA. Right? He needs to say something to the passengers to reassure them. And the PA he makes is probably going to go to the history as one of the most understated PAs ever made.
I said, well, if I'm going to talk on the passenger address, I'm going to talk to the passengers as well. They're going to hear everything I say. So really, I suppose I've got to sound laid back, laconic, in control, and I have to tell them something. But what do I tell them? And my intent was to get the attention of the CSD and the cabin crew, and I got the attention of the world's press. And I didn't intend to do that, but I did. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Eric Moody again. We have a small problem in that all 4 engines have failed. We're doing our utmost to get them going. I trust you're not in too much distress. And would the CSD please come to the flight deck? And that little bit at the end is a signal in British Airways for the cabin crew to prepare for a crash landing or a ditching.
After the PA, the cabin crew is invited into the cockpit, and Captain Moody is trying to give them briefing about what's going on, but because he still is wearing his oxygen mask, he finds it very hard to communicate. And the purser doesn't hear anything of what he's saying, but he understands that he is actually, doing more harm than good in the cockpit, so he just nods and gets out of the cockpit, goes down to brief the rest of the crew about a potential emergency landing. The jumbo jet is now getting close to their cutoff altitude of 12,000 feet, and Captain Eric is starting to think about the possibility that they might have to ditch this huge aircraft in the ocean. And he's well aware that trying to ditch an aircraft of this size at night, where it's extremely hard to judge the height over the waves, has a very low likelihood of succeeding. But as he's starting to contemplate this, he's interrupted by the jubilation from his fellow crew members when the number 4 engine starts up. Remember the first one that they shut down? That one is now starting up. And after that, in fairly quick succession, they managed to start all 4 engines. So initially, they reduce the descent rate. With the second engine being started, they can start a very shallow climb. And then eventually they have all 4 engines available to them. And Captain Eric now wants to get up, get away from the mountains and get precious altitude as quickly as possible. And this is not the end of the troubles for this crew. And I'm going to tell you all about it after this short message from my sponsor. I also want to take a few seconds here to say a special thank you to the sponsor of this episode, which is Skillshare. Now, I know that you are watching this because you are a curious person, a lifelong learner, someone who constantly wants to improve and understand the world around you better. And in that case, Skillshare is definitely something that you should be checking out. Okay, they have thousands of high-quality video courses and pretty much anything that you can imagine. A course that I'm using myself at the moment is 5 Minutes Creativity with Jasmine Cheyenne, where she gives kind of hands-on tips on how to chisel out a few minutes to be creative every single day. And it's something that I personally really need. But there are also courses in, storytelling, creative photography, or even how to use your own home simulator to improve and prepare before you start your private pilot license. So if you think, Peter, that sounds amazing, well then the 1,001st of you guys who clicks on this link here below will get 1 month of premium Skillshare absolutely for free. So click the link and start exploring your curiosity today. At time 2057, that's 17 minutes after the crew first started seeing the St. Elmo's fire outside of the aircraft, the first officer called up Jakarta Control with the following message. Jakarta, Speedbird 9, we're back in business, all 4 engines operating. The crew was now anxious to try to climb up to gain some precious altitude again, because remember, they didn't know whether or not the engines would fail again on them, and if they could get a little bit more altitude, it meant that they could potentially climb over the mountain range and reach Jakarta. So they put some extra thrust on the engines, they started climbing, and when they reached about 15,000 feet, the St. Elmo's fire phenomenon was back on the windscreen. And as they leveled off at 15,000 feet and the thrust came back, the number 2 engine started vibrating so violently that they thought that it was going to seriously damage the aircraft, so they reluctantly shut down engine number 2 again. Now remember, the crew still doesn't know why this is happening, but Captain Moody is now starting to kind of put 2 and 2 together and think that this phenomenon that's causing the St. Elmo's fire outside maybe has something to do with the engine failures as well. So he decides that they need to get out of it. They need to descend back down to 12,000 feet where they know that this phenomenon was not there. Before we go any further, I just want to give you a possible explanation to why the crew was actually able to start the engines again. Remember how we talked about how the ash would melt and stick to internal components inside of the engine? Well, it is very possible that as the engines were cooling down after the failures, this melted ash started to get really hard. And as they were trying to restart the engines, it broke off the internal components, enabling the rotating parts to start rotating again, and thus enabling them to start the engines. But now, since the crew has once again entered the ash cloud and now the engines are starting to heat up again, it was really crucial that they descended out of it as quickly as possible. The crew now asked for the weather in Jakarta. The weather in Jakarta was beautiful, clear sky, no clouds, light and variable winds. So they started receiving radar vectors in towards Jakarta. They were very reluctant to change the thrust setting because they knew that the engines were operating at the thrust setting that they had. So instead they were using drag, like speed brakes for example, to control the speed and the descent rate of the aircraft. They were vectored in for a traffic circuit in a right-hand pattern in towards Jakarta, and as they were turning in towards the runway, they realized that they had real problems seeing the airport. No matter how they tried to look for it, even though it was clear outside, they just could not see the runway. And they very quickly realized that the reason they couldn't see it was because their windscreens was completely opaque. They were completely sandblasted and was like looking through a shower curtain. But they managed to find on both the right and the left-hand side a small strip of windscreen which they could look through. The next problem here was that the ILS in Jakarta had an inoperative glide slope, so they didn't have an ILS, an instrument landing system, available. Instead, they had to fly a localizer approach, which would have been normal procedures if it weren't for the fact that even as they get closer to the minima, they wouldn't be able to see the runway. So the crew worked together. Captain Eric was flying the localizer, getting distances and altitude checks from the first officer, and basically descending based on what the first officer was telling him, creating kind of a virtual glide slope. Very much the same way that we fly constant angle non-precision approaches today. And in interviews later on, Captain Moody has described the way that he had to fly this localizer approach without being able to see the runway. It was like negotiating your way up a badger's ass, which I thought was a great way of explaining it. Anyway, as they got closer to the runway and Captain Moody could look out through that little strip of window that he could see, he managed to get the aircraft down towards the runway. But it felt like an eternity before the landing gear finally touched the ground in a really nice, smooth butter landing. And as the aircraft touched down, the crew received what is potentially the world's most deserved applause and jubilations from the passengers in the aircraft. This is an amazing feat. It's an amazing show of teamwork. It's an amazing show of communication, situational awareness, and airmanship. Now, the crew then decided that they wanted to try to taxi the aircraft off the runway. But as soon as they turned off the runway and they were faced with the lights from the apron and from the terminals, it basically just flooded their completely opaque flight deck windows. So instead, they just stopped the aircraft and asked for a tug to pull them in towards their parking position.
The windows have gone opaque, even down the side, because they were all sandblasted, but the front ones to a greater extent. So when we turned around, I couldn't see out. I couldn't see the side of the runway, and he had to taxi it back. We got to and turned off, and once we faced terminal building. Neither of us could see out, so we just stopped it, switched the engines off, and I went downstairs to while we waited for the tug to come out, just to talk to the first class passengers. And there was actually an old captain in there, an old BOAC captain, who wanted to tell me the story about he'd lost 4 engines on the Lancaster over Bermuda during the war. I just didn't want to know, but there we go. He didn't think it was anything fascinating. And I sat on my hands, as one does on a table in the middle of the flight of the first class cabin. And when I got back upstairs, I was getting in my seat to be towed in, and I looked at my hands and I said to the other two, "Look at that, black." And the engineer said, "I reckon that's volcanic dust."
There were several days before the crew was told the reason for their quadruple engine failure, but they had kind of figured it out already. As they disembarked the aircraft, they noticed that there was a lot of volcanic ash on the whole aircraft. The airspace around the active volcano was closed down for a few weeks, but then opened up again. And only 19 days later, Singapore Airlines Boeing 747 flew into the same area and had to shut down 3 of its engines. And after that, they permanently closed down the airspace until the volcanic eruption had subsided. What happened to the flight crew then? Well, the flight crew was given several commendations, among them the Queen's Commendation for valuable service in the air and a couple of medals from the British Airline Pilot Association. The 747 in itself was ferried back to London a few days after this incident, where they replaced one of the engines, and then it continued to operate for British Airways for several years before it went over to the ownership of European Air Charter, and then finally was taken out of commission in 2004. This incident and other incidents involving volcanic ash really opened up the eyes to the aviation industry about the dangers of flying into volcanic ash. So it had a huge impact on the way that we are training in the simulator now, where we have regular training scenarios on how to effectively deal with if you for some reason fly into an ash cloud. What has been shown is that what's really important is to exit the ash cloud as soon as possible and try to maintain as low engine thrust as possible in order to get the core temperature of the engines down when you're escaping. If a flight crew today would enter into an area where we believe that there might be a high concentration of volcanic ash, we are taught to do the following. We turn around 180 degrees around. We set a lower altitude on our mode control panel. We hit level change so the aircraft starts descending, and then we disconnect the auto throttle and close the thrust levers, right? So make sure that we have minimum thrust, and then we continue to hopefully get out of the ash cloud, deal with any engine malfunctions that we might have, if there might be increases in exhaust gas temperature or if the engine stops responding to thrust lever input. There are checklists to do this. But the important thing here is that we know what to do if we see these telltale signs that the crew of British Airways Flight 9 encountered. Also, the meteorological services around the world are now very keen on checking if there is a volcanic eruption somewhere to predict where the ash cloud might move and to declare those non-fly zones. Okay, we all remember what happened after the volcanic eruption on Iceland, which basically stopped the aviation business in Europe for several days. But now we are also better at predicting this, all right? We're better at knowing where the ash clouds are and completely avoiding them. So once again, this was an incident that has made the aviation world safer. It's made our understanding about this particular phenomenon better. And that's what I wanted to give you through this video. As always, guys, I hope that you have enjoyed this video. I hope that I have earned a subscription from you. In that case, make sure that you highlight the little notification bell as well, so that you know when I'm coming out with more material. If you want to support the channel, then the best way of doing so is becoming a member of my Patreon crew. I really appreciate all of my members. They're supporting me both financially, but also by giving me valuable feedback about my videos. We have weekly Zoom hangouts where we talk about everything from what they're doing in their lives to what questions they have about aviation, and it's really, really fun to do so. If you think that that sounds like something you want to do, then go into patreon.com/mentorpilot. There's a link in the description below as well, and you can support with as little or as much as you like. Everything is appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.